In this lecture, we're going to use data from an external JSON file. But before we get to that, let's first try to understand the current scenario. So what do we have here? Well, we are generating some credentials here on the fly, and we're using these credentials to register a new user. And then once that user is registered, further down, we are actually getting an auth token, which we then can use to make authenticated requests. Now let's just assume that we don't want to create users all the time we run this test, and maybe we want to use an existing set of users and to just use those users against the logging endpoint and to get token. I already have here a users.json file, which is an object containing a property users and then a list of username and passwords. Now, these users don't actually exist right now, but in this lecture, we're going to take a look at how we can read this file in K6, how we can use these users, how can we register all these users, and then use them in one of the upcoming endpoints. And when we are trying to work with external data files, we don't want every virtual user to load an external file because that will cause a memory issue. So for that reason, we're going to use a concept which is called a shared array. So essentially, a shared array is an array that is created as a result of reading data from a file. And this array is shared by all virtual users. So let me show you how we can use this shared array. First of all, we're going to go ahead and import it. So shared array is part of K6 data. I'm going to write here import shared array. This is going to be from K6 data. Right. So now that we have imported this, it is super important that we are not doing this inside the default function. So I'm inside the init stage and outside of the default function. This is where this is happening. So what we're going to do here, we're going to initialize a new shared array. And the shared array will take a name. And the second thing that it will take is actually a callback function. I'm going to just write the initial syntax so that we can get that out of our way. Okay, so this is the initial syntax. Now, there are a few things that will come here. First of all, the new shared array needs a name, so we can just provide something like users with credentials. And then in this callback function, what actually happens is that, first of all, we are opening the file. So what is the name of the file? The name of the file is users.json. So I'm going to reference it locally. So it's in the same directory. So it's going to be dot, meaning this directory, /users.json. Now, this file here is JSON, but we actually need a JavaScript object. So for that, we're going to use json.parse. We're going to parse what we are reading from here. And after we're done parsing, we're actually going to read the property users. So this is the property that we are actually interested in from this file. And finally, because this is a function, we also need to return this. I'm going to write here return. So we are returning the result of parsing the contents of the file, and then we are getting the user's property. Now, in order to access this shared array, you also need to put it in a variable. I'm going to call this variable user credentials. All right. So now that we have these user credentials, what we could do is simply use console log. And let's make sure that so far our code is working as expected. I'm going to use K6 to run this file. And somewhere here in the logs, we should see what we have here. So this is the list of users that we have. Okay, so it means that so far we have a JavaScript object with all these users. Perfect. Now, these users do not exist yet, so we need to create them. So the idea would be that in our default function, we're going to replace here the credentials with something else. So essentially, we want to go through this file, item by item, and run a request to create a user. In order to do that, we're going to use here user credentials. And on this array, we have the function which is called for each. So for each is a relatively simple function because it allows us to go item by item. So this will be a function here. I'm just going to write the initial syntax so that we know what we're dealing with. And then we need to move the code that is creating a user. I'm going to copy everything from here. I'm going to put it here inside the for each. What is happening now is that for every of these, we are going to create a new registration. Now we also need the data that is in the file. In order to access the data, we are going to use actually item. So I'm going to get here and remove this. I'm going to write here item dot, and the name of the property is username. So item dot username, and the password would be item dot password. So this is how we can then reference this data from there. So we're creating this credential, we are passing it to post, and then finally we're making a small check here to make sure everything is okay. Okay, this part with authentication is something that we don't need right now. So I'm gonna just add a comment here before the function is closing. So that code is not executed. We're only going over the credentials, and for each of them, we are registering a user, and hopefully we're gonna get only a status 201, being that these users have been created. So let's do this once again. Okay, so what we see here, 9 requests have been executed, and none of them have been successful. Okay, so we can take a look and see what exactly is going on and why this hasn't been successful yet. So the best way is to enable debugging. I'm going to use HTTP debug, and I'm going to also use full so that we can see exactly what we're sending and what we're getting back. This is just part of the process. Okay, so let's see what is coming back. So essentially we're getting here a user with an username already exists. So there are a few things here that don't work as expected. But it seems that these users have already been created. So it really depends on how we have this data. So if we run through this set once, then of course it's not going to work. But let me just make a quick change so that we can run this once again. So I'm going to search for test underscore, and I'm going to replace this with test underscore 2 underscore. I don't know, just adding different users here. Okay, so now we should have a set of new users that we can create. I'm going to go again through this. Okay, so we have only status 201. 9 requests have been executed, and everything looks good here. So we don't need the debug. Perfect. So now the first step is done. We have created these users, and we can say, there are a few things that we don't need. So now that we have created these users and we know that this users.json contains real users that we can use, perfect. Let's go ahead and remove this function altogether. This is something that we don't need anymore right now. So all we need is to get an authentication token. We can remove the comment here so that we make this code valid once again. And what's important now to notice is that there is no credentials object anymore, right? So this is something that we now need to get from this list of arrays practically. So in this case, we can take advantage of random item. So we can provide to random item an array and just say, hey, from this list of credentials, which we have read from the file, give me just one random item. I'm going to import here random item, and we can actually replace here random string because that's something that we're not using anymore. And I'm going to create here a new variable, and I call it random credential. And we're going to use here random item on user credential. So this should give us a random item. Then from this random credential, we can reference it here and here. So we're going to have the username and the password. Okay, so this is probably the only change that we need. Let's try to run it again, but we're going to leave HTTP debug on in case something doesn't work so that we can check. Okay, so we still have a small issue here. Res is not defined, so we need to course, first define res, the response. Let's simply run it again. We're going to check here. Status is 200, has access token. Yeah, we're getting here the information. So we can even check like what is the username that's being used for the login is this username. And we can check it here in the list. I'm going to find it. Okay, this is the second username. Perfect. Let's run it once again. Again, tests are passing that we have here. We're going to copy this username and check it in the file. And we're going to see here is the third one. So it's always something random from this file. But in a nutshell, this is how we can read from an external JSON file and use this data in your requests.